Hello and welcome to China Dispatches, a European Chamber podcast that shares on-the-ground insights from European business leaders and experts on doing business in China. I'm your host, Gao Rui. In the past year, the Chinese government has been promoting visa-free policies to boost inbound travel. During this summer, news about the big boom of China's inbound tourists is all over the Chinese media. Foreign vloggers posted tons of travel in China videos, and some of them went viral on Chinese social media. In this episode, we will look at two aspects of inbound travel: the resumption of international flights and China's visa-free policies. I'm going to be joined by Remi Paul, chair of the European Chamber's Aviation and Aerospace Working Group, and my colleague Austin Bliss, Policy and Communications Coordinator. Thank you very much for joining. From January to July 2024, over 17.2 million foreigners visited China, marking a 129% year-on-year increase, according to the National Immigration Administration. However, the number of foreign visitors in the first half of 2024 still fell short of the pre-pandemic benchmark in 2019. What's the current situation of air traffic recovery to and from China?
Thank you for your question. I think it's important to get back into time and to see what's happened after the pandemics. So if we take a look at the situation, we can say that it's been a very gradual progression with two big differences between the domestic traffic in China and the international, which is our first concern today. We have seen a very quick recovery in the domestic traffic, which means that up to now in 2024, we're around 115% to what it was before pandemics. The situation is much more different regarding international air traffic. There are various reasons and there are various situations. First of all, as I said, it was a very progressive one because if we observe 2023, we started, of course, from a very, very low because, first of all, many aircraft were not available because as soon as the decision was taken by the central government to open up China, not all of the airlines had the time to get prepared in order to face this new situation. Of course, they were very professional and CAC also supported them a lot, but there was a need to restart a system that had been completely stopped for at least 2 to 3 years. So if we look at the figures, I think we can assume safely that at the beginning of 2023, the international traffic started at around 10% of what it used to be before pandemics. And at the end of 2023, we observed that, if I'm correct, international flights reach approximately 63% of what they used to be before pandemic, and total international passengers being around 40%. There is, of course, a difference between the number of flights and the number of passengers because airlines try to make available a certain number of destinations. And, of course, there is some delay in the demand getting back on track. If you look at the situation in 2023, there was a strong reduction of destinations. We, at the time, 330 routes were not fully reinstated. The international traffic between China and the rest of the world lost 40 destinations and 8 countries. So progressive resumption in 2023. During the first half of 2024, well, the continuation of this effort, we see a slowly but gradual and steady progression of the number of flights. And we are right now at a level of approximately 70%, 75%, depending on the week, in terms of international traffic between China and the rest of the world.
What about the recovery of foreign carriers compared to domestic carriers?
Well, there is the interesting question because there is a huge difference between what has happened in China and what has happened in the rest of the world. Many different reasons. First of all, I think the mobilization of Chinese airlines has been extremely strong and focused on international traffic. As you know, the war between Russia and Ukraine has led the European Union and other countries to take decisions and not to allow their airlines to fly over the territory of the Russian Federation. This has a direct impact on the cost for most Western airlines and especially the European ones. So there is what we could call a slight disruption in the traffic because the terms of the competition between Chinese airlines, which are allowed to fly above Russia. And Western, especially European companies, is not at all the same. This has direct consequences in terms of cost of fuel, in terms of cost of the staff, because you know that due to the safety regulation, which are extremely severe in the commercial traffic business on airlines, we have extremely severe restrictions on the number of hours that the pilots especially can perform a specific flight. So I think we went from 3 captains to 4 captains in terms of numbers for those China-Europe flights. So this has a direct cost. We also have the influence of the political environment and especially the relationship between the US and China. There have been a very, very progressive negotiation between both states about the resumptions of the number of destinations. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I think we are approximately at 70 flights per week for both countries. But if we see that Chinese airlines are fully using their quota, this is not the case right now with the American airlines, because American airlines, due to this cost issue and due also to the lack of demand in the US, they have not yet reinstated those Chinese destinations. And before that, they have preferred also to focus on some more profitable destinations, namely Europe, namely Middle East, etc. So there is a difference. If we look at Chinese airlines, as I said before, there's been a clear focus on the resumption of international traffic. And also there's been a clear focus on some new areas on which China now puts the focus on. So I would quote Southeast Asia. I would quote Middle East. This is also due to the very proactive stance that the Chinese economy as a whole is taking towards what we call the New South. So this is one of the aspects. Another aspect is that in some destinations, if you look at Australia, for example, the Australian aircraft carriers have decided, due to the lack of demand, also to stop operations with China. This is the case for Qantas especially. So that means that the Australia-China market is purely now reserved to Chinese airlines. So this is, I would say, part of the explanations, and that show that there's a very vibrant activity for Chinese airlines on the international front. Another explication may be to the progressive takeoff of the international traffic that I mentioned previously, and the impediment that some airlines are facing is also the crisis in terms of supply chain for the commercial aeronautical industrial apparel in the world. You know that due to the Ukrainian crisis, due to COVID also, many production lines have been interrupted or have been facing supply issues. We're talking about semiconductors, we're talking about key metals, and that means that there is a lack of parts, a lack of components, and there are delays. We know that some companies, some very famous airframers have been facing very strong difficulties in their production capacity, in re-implementing their production practices. And so this has a direct impact on the number of available aircraft for the companies, which of course had planned for a very long time to reinforce their capacity. And now they're facing a certain lack or delays in the delivery of planes. So all those factors combined might explain exactly the situation.
You mentioned Australia has cancelled their airlines to and from China. And also in the past few months, a number of other foreign carriers announced the suspension of international flights between Beijing, Shanghai, and other major cities in the world. Do you want to add any other reasons for the current recovery situation and the withdrawal of the flights?
I think that's basically it. We must realize that we are in a transitional phase, which is also linked to the state of the Chinese economy. We understand that the growth is there, but not to the extent that we wish to. The international environment that I mentioned before is also having an influence on the activity of the global world economy. We need to have a little bit more trust, I guess. We're in a pre-election period in the US, so there are a lot of uncertainties as far as the geopolitical geopolitical environment is concerned, which means that could explain the relocation that I mentioned of some part of the fleet capacities for some airlines to some destination rather than Chinese destinations. My impression is that it is a momentary situation. Once all the uncertainties will be clarified, there should be, and if we look at all the assumptions, this is the global appreciation, there should be the continuation of the progression of the international traffic, and we all consider that we're going to reach something like 80% at the end of 24 of the previous traffic in 2019, and that most probably in 2025, 26 the latest, we will see a resumption to 100% of the international traffic between China and the rest of the world, which means that those capacity that we lost and those issues that we mentioned regarding the economic choices that were made by international foreign airlines might change and might also reflect the improvement of the situation.
So the 2025 estimation, does that only include foreign carriers or foreign and domestic carriers combined?
That includes, of course, combined. And the key question is which will be the share of the Chinese companies and the foreign companies. This is the unknown factor because, as I said, it's also very much dependent on geopolitics and Ukraine situation, which has and will have the same effect if the conflict goes on as it has been for the past 2 years.
China has published or expanded many visa-free policies from end of 2023 to August 2024, and relevant information are widely publicized by the Chinese government and domestic media. According to the immigration authorities, out of the 14.6 million foreign visitors in China in the first half of 2024, over 8.5 million were visa-free entrants, making up 58% of inbound travel, reflecting a 190% increase year-on-year. Did you see an acceleration of the inbound air traffic recovery in the aftermath of the visa-free policies?
Of course, there has been an influence. As a French citizen, I can observe that France was among the countries which benefited from the visa-free situation. And it's clear that I've seen, and we've seen in my own company, that this, as of course, makes our life much more easier. And decisions to travel to China were much quicker than it used to be. This is true also in our personal lives, because we see that among our friends and families, when you are a resident in China, this has been a tremendous support and change for somebody who has lived in China in the 2000s and who has visited China since the end of the 90s. It is such an impressive change and a strong decision, so that it definitely had an impact. It would have had a superior impact had the economic situation and, as I said, the world economy been on a much more favorable path. But I think this is typically the kind of a very positive stimulus for air traffic and for the economy as a whole.
You mentioned before that the demand in the US and also in Australia to travel to China is relatively low, and that contributes to the low level of resumption of their airlines. Do you think the visa-free policy will overweigh the geopolitical tensions and other issues to stimulus like foreigners to travel to China?
Oh my gosh, this is far beyond my pay grade question. But I think that, of course, all the measures that can be perceived as amicable, such as the visa-free policy, truly contribute in building trust, truly contribute in making things easier for economic actors and citizens. As a child of the globalization, I think that it's pretty obvious. We have seen the world economy developing by the easing of all the hurdles that can prevent economic actors to meet, and more than economic actors, people to meet and understand each other. So this is definitely what I think a very positive measure.
Austin, what do you make of the similarly impressive increase of foreign visitors and visa-free entry numbers? given that most foreign travelers were still banned at the start of 2023?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to bear in mind two things. One, which sort of Remi already mentioned regarding planes, that airlines needed time to reassign their planes to routes to China, especially foreign airlines. Travelers as well, especially travelers coming from places particularly far away like Europe, like North America, they needed time to make plans to come to China. It's not something that you usually just say, well, we're going to go next week. That might be the case for some business travel, but even for business travelers, people prefer to make a plan. Now, on the COVID sort of restriction side, it was not until April of 2023 that the PCR test requirement was dropped for inbound travelers. It was replaced then with an antigen test, which was self-declared on a health declaration. And then finally, the antigen test was dropped in August of 2023. And then finally, the health declaration was dropped in November of 2023. But then you had the visa issue as well. And of course, before the visa-free travel was announced, which was the case for all EU countries in the first half of 2023, there was no visa-free travel. So those travelers needed to get a visa still. It wasn't until March that basically visa issuance returned to normal pre-pandemic sort of policy without any special requirements. So these were all major barriers for people to come. The fact that 2023 was still so heavily restricted, it's very impressive that in 2024, China has been able to sort of turn this around and bring in a lot of new travelers. I believe that the visa-free policies are a big reason for this. And I think if we look at the high proportion of the arrivals of foreign nationals into China that are visa-free travelers, that itself is a symbol of just how much the visa-free travel matters, because people don't like to get a visa. So actually the proportion of countries with visa-free access globally is still relatively low. Most nationalities coming to China, including very important countries like the US and the UK, for most situations still need visas. So the fact that they're able to get such a high proportion of travelers using visa-free schemes, I think shows that these schemes do work, they do attract people, and they do facilitate trips that otherwise may not have happened.
Could you briefly walk us through the different visa-free policies that's relevant to business travel?
Basically, you can put these policies into two camps. There's true visa-free travel, and then there's visa-free transit. So let's first talk about the true visa-free travel. This is what was extended to some EU member states in the later half of 2023, and it's since been expanded to a few more, but still not all EU member states have this. In the case of countries that have it, it's a 15-day genuine visa-free travel scheme. So you can show up with your passport, and you can stay for 15 days from the day of arrival, and you can leave traveling on to wherever you'd like to go next, whether it's returning to the country you started from or somewhere else. That's all fine. And while you're in China, you can essentially go anywhere you'd like to in China as long as it's someplace that foreign nationals are regularly permitted to travel. Sometimes people who've used this have found that immigration authorities might ask for ongoing flight, your return flight, maybe they'll ask for a hotel booking. This is pretty standard for visa-free travel to any country in the world, that immigration authorities can ask some questions to determine if the purpose of your visit genuinely meets the conditions for visa-free travel, which in the case of China's scheme is business trips, tourism, visiting family are all okay. You should expect that immigration officers may ask for some supporting documentation, such as a hotel booking, maybe a letter from your company inviting you to come, or maybe even just a business card or the contact number of somebody from your company who's invited you. Those would be good things to prepare in advance, just in case you're asked for them. The second camp of visa-free policies are the transit policies. These are offered to quite a few more countries, including all EU member states, the United States, the United Kingdom. So if you're from a country that usually has visa-free travel to most countries in the world, you'd expect you probably on the list for the visa-free transit schemes as well. But the key part of these is that they are transit. So what does this mean? Well, in practice, there's essentially three types of visa-free transit schemes. The first one's the 24-hour scheme. And then there's a 72-hour scheme and a 144-hour scheme, which are very similar. Let's first talk about the 24-hour visa-free transit scheme. This, in practice, is essentially born out of the idea of airside transit, where you can land at an airport, you can not proceed through immigration. Maybe you'll go through security again, and then you'll be let into the transit area, and you can get on your flight to another country or region. In practice, though, there's a provision in the 24-hour visa-free transit scheme that lets you actually leave the airport, either to stay overnight in a hotel or because you're taking a domestic flight within China to go onwards to another international flight. So, for example, if you're flying into Beijing from France to Beijing, and you land in Beijing, and your next flight is from Shanghai to Hong Kong, under the 24-hour scheme, you could actually take a domestic flight from Beijing to Shanghai to catch your onward flight to Hong Kong. This would be allowed in most cases. Now, I say most cases because it's at the discretion of immigration authorities, as is the case with any country in the world, have the right to deny you entry for any reason, and they may not necessarily provide a reason. However, if you're doing a genuine transit, it's usually going to be okay. Where people get into issues with the 24-hour scheme is that if you have a very short connection in the same airport, you may be denied permission to leave the airport. In other words, you may actually have to remain in the transit area. So it's not a guarantee in that case, which can be a bit frustrating for people. We only have anecdotal reports of this. This is not an official policy. So it sort of comes down to how it's implemented by the immigration officer that you end up encountering at the airport. There's no way to know in advance. So I would only recommend people use this in very limited circumstances. Maybe if you just have an overnight layover in a city. So now the second basket of visa-free schemes are the 72-hour and 144-hour schemes. These essentially function in the same way. However, the difference between the two is that some cities operate a 72-hour scheme, some cities operate a 144-hour scheme. Most of China's big major international business cities, so there's Shanghai, Beijing, and then Guangdong, so Shenzhen and Guangzhou, they're on 144-hour schemes, which gives you plenty of time to have a reasonable business trip during that time. The essence of it, similarly to the 24-hour scheme, is transit. So you need to be coming from one country or territory and leaving to another country or territory. The reason we say country or territory is because Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan are considered to be separate territories for these schemes. So you can count them essentially as their own place. So if you're coming from, for example, Hong Kong, and you fly into Beijing, and you get your flight back to Macau, that's okay. You can do that because they're two separate territories. And so it will be counted as a transit, you traveling from Hong Kong to Macau via Beijing. It's not very practical if you just want to go to Macau, but if you wanted to come to Beijing and stay for 6 days, it's one way you could do it. So then the other sort of niche visa-free policy, which is not going to be applicable to most business travel, but there are occasionally business functions in the region, is the Hainan visa-free policy. So this policy offers 30 days visa-free on Hainan Island for nationalities of a pretty wide range of countries, similar to the 144-hour visa-free travel scheme. This is a bit difficult to make use of because of the limited number of international flights into Hainan. There are quite a few from Hong Kong, so that's a good starting point. But essentially what it allows you to do is enter Hainan. You can stay for up to 30 days visa-free for a variety of purposes, including business travel, tourism, visiting family, and a few others as well. And you have to leave directly from Hainan. But you can go back to the same place you came from. So it is a true visa-free scheme, and that you can come from anywhere and you can leave from anywhere, as long as it's not mainland China. So don't expect to leave Hainan during that time, and don't take a flight via mainland China to your final destination outside of China, because that will also be considered as you having left Hainan and you'll be in trouble.
Remi, is there anyone from your company's headquarters or anyone you know that visited China using any of these visa-free policies or transit policies? How did that go?
Well, yes, of course. I would say that right now, most of our visitors from my company are using this visa-free scheme. We seldom have more than 15 days business trips on very rare occasions, maybe sometimes some expert coming for a special technical activity. But as I said, very few such cases. So most of our business travelers are actually using without, as far as I know, any problem faced when entering the country.
Austin, could you also explain some of the nuances, the most neglected nuances that lead to some of the denials of entrance that people posting on YouTube, for example?
Yeah, so actually, when we were following China's promotion of these visa-free schemes, we noticed that a WeChat post from the National Immigration Administration, which was trying to talk about how great the 144-hour visa-free transit scheme was, it included a screenshot of YouTube talking about how foreign vloggers had all used the scheme and there was a big wave of foreign vloggers visiting China, which is true. What they didn't seem to notice was that the screenshot that they'd chosen from YouTube included about 3 of the 6 or so videos that had big titles that said denied or detained in Beijing airport, because people have a lot of trouble using the transit schemes. So the visa-free scheme, as Remi mentioned, is pretty straightforward. You can come, you can stay 15 days. They don't really care where you came from or where you're going after. If you have a passport from one of those countries, that's great, you're good to go. If you do need to make use of one of these visa-free transit schemes, you should be careful to make sure that your trip genuinely meets the requirements. The root of this is, are you transiting? That's the most important thing to remember. Are you coming from one country or region and going to another country or region? But there's a few things to watch out for here. Many people will find, cheap flights with a connection involved. If you're making a connection, that can be okay, but you need to make sure that your connection is, first of all, an international connection, and secondly, some place that you didn't come from. So for example, if you're flying from Hong Kong to Beijing, and then your next stop after Beijing is to go to, let's say, Sydney, Australia, you might find a really great flight from Beijing to Sydney via Hong Kong. And you might think, oh, well, I'll take that. I'll do my 144-hour visa-free transit in Beijing, and then I'll proceed to Sydney. No, you can't do that because you came from Hong Kong. So you're not transiting. Even though you might say, well, but my final destination is Sydney. I've booked this on one ticket. I'm not going to leave the airport in Hong Kong. I'm proceeding to Sydney. It doesn't qualify because you arrived in Beijing from Hong Kong and you are leaving Beijing for Hong Kong. They don't really care if you're transiting or not, where you're going. They care where your flight arriving into China is coming from and where your flight leaving China is coming from. So in that case, you might say, okay, well, I can't do that, but I found a great ticket from Beijing to Sydney via Guangzhou. That also does not qualify because by flying from Beijing to Guangzhou, you are leaving the Jingjinji area, which is the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei, which is the area you're allowed to stay on the 144-hour scheme. And so you're breaking the conditions of your stay by taking a domestic flight. And even if they let you on the flight once you get to Guangzhou and try to go through immigration to leave China, you're going to have a problem because they're going to discover that you've broken your conditions of stay. You'll probably be fined. I'm not quite sure what would happen, but don't try it. It's also likely that if your airline was doing a decent job of checking, which they try to check very carefully before you fly into China, that you meet the requirements, they will discover that you don't meet the requirements and you'd be denied boarding from the beginning and your whole trip would have to be changed. Basically, there are 2 big mistakes people make with flight connections. Flight connection in the country that you came from or a flight connection within China. Both of these are not acceptable. You need to have a flight connection either in a new place or you can fly directly onwards to your destination. So for both the 144-hour and 72-hour schemes, and keep in mind this is a difference than the 24-hour scheme, you must stay within the area of the scheme you are making use of. So for a traveler, you can essentially think of these schemes as an individual scheme operated by each city. So if you want to go to Beijing, you'll use Beijing scheme, which allows you to be in Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei. You can't leave those 3 places during your stay in China. It doesn't matter that Shanghai also operates a 144-hour visa-free travel scheme. If you want to make use of Shanghai's scheme, you need to leave China, come back, and start over again. You can't combine them in one trip. That's very important. You also should not and probably cannot try to cheat the scheme by saying, okay, well, I need to go to Shenyang, and I'm just going to take a day trip up there. There's a high-speed train. It's pretty reasonable from Beijing for a day trip if you're committed. In China, all your train tickets, all your bus tickets will be purchased with your passport. You will almost definitely be caught. And I wouldn't recommend trying to outsmart them on this one. In general, these visa-free transit schemes operated by each city offer a list of ports or checkpoints that you can enter and exit from. you must leave and arrive from one of the ports within the scheme. You can pick different ones. So you can, for example, fly into Beijing Capital Airport. You can fly out of Beijing Daxing Airport. That's not a problem. But you must pick one from the list. So you should pay attention to the list in advance. But in most cases, major airports in these schemes are all included. So you're probably not going to have a problem finding an acceptable port of entry and exit. There is one case which is a bit confusing, and that's Guangdong Province's scheme. Now, Guangdong borders Hong Kong and Macau, which are, as I mentioned, considered to be separate territories, for immigration purposes. So it's a common case that people maybe want to visit Hong Kong and Guangdong in the same trip. So if you want to make use of the visa-free 145-hour scheme that Guangdong offers from Hong Kong or from Macau, there are some ways to do so, but it's very, very complicated. So you should do your research before and make sure that you're well prepared. Guangdong allows people to enter through several major airports and a few seaports. So when you make your entry, you can fly into Guangzhou, you can fly into Shenzhen. There is one ferry from Hong Kong you could take to Shenzhen's Shekou port that would also presumably qualify. Now, when you leave Guangdong on the 144-hour scheme, you can choose most ports in Guangdong. There's a list of about 30 or so, but they're essentially all the publicly open checkpoints that are open to the public. You can leave from any of those within 144 hours. These include land checkpoints with Hong Kong and Macau, as well as the high-speed rail from the mainland to Hong Kong. So you can leave from that. However, you cannot arrive from these checkpoints. If you're making a trip to Hong Kong and Guangdong, probably the best way to do it would be to fly into Guangzhou or Shenzhen from another country and then have your time there and then book a high-speed train from Guangdong to Hong Kong. And you would then be able to exit through the checkpoint in the high-speed rail station without issue, assuming, of course, you need to purchase your high-speed train ticket in advance.
The European Chamber's WeChat account has published an article that focuses on visa-free policies and explained these different schemes and also the neglected nuances that Austin helped prepare. So if you want to read this again in a more systematic way, please visit our WeChat account and search visa-free to locate this article. So if you were in charge of making or revising visa policies, what changes would you make to better boost inbound travel?
Well, I think the biggest problem with the transit policies is that they are needlessly complicated and they confuse travelers. It makes sense to me, and I think it makes sense to people who've spent some time in China and are familiar with the way that policies are made. But for your average traveler, the idea that they can choose between all these different Chinese cities, which all operate these similar schemes, they have to check which port of entry they're going to be arriving from, make sure that it qualifies, and then they have to make sure that they stay within a certain prescribed area. They also have to make sure that they leave on a qualifying flight. It's a bit convoluted, and it does tend to confuse a lot of people. I think that given that in these cases, they allow people to essentially come in with no prior screening. So there's no visa application involved. You show up and you only are screened by an immigration officer when you arrive at the airport. That it would be wise to consider expanding genuine visa-free access to the nationalities that already qualify for the 144-hour and 72-hour schemes. Because by using the transit scheme as sort of the excuse to give visa-free access to certain cities, you confuse travelers, you result in a lot of burden for airlines who have to understand all these schemes and make sure that people who fly qualify for them in advance. And you actually just encourage people to make China a very short stop on their trip, both for business travel and tourists, because you can only stay for 6 days in one place without leaving and starting over again. And you also can't really take advantage of a lot of what China has to offer. It's a very big country. A lot of people want to come, both tourists and business travelers want to come and see Beijing and Shanghai, maybe another city as well, like Xi'an or something for tourists. And they can't do that on these schemes. They have to pick one city. The only way they could do that is to fly in and out several times. I wouldn't recommend doing it too much because, of course, in any case, your permission to enter China will be at the discretion of immigration authorities. I would strongly encourage China to consider expanding genuine visa-free travel to more nationalities in the future.
In addition to visa-free travel and resumption flights, there are also a number of other policies to boost inbound travel, like making payments easier for visitors and requiring all hotels to accept foreign nationals. Do you think these have had or will have an impact?
Yeah, so I think these are really important because even if people come here, both business travelers and tourists, if they don't have a good experience, China has wasted its time by introducing these visa-free travel policies if people come here and don't have a good experience. Two of the biggest issues that foreign visitors face are payments and lodging. I think lodging is less of a problem for business travelers who stay in bigger, more expensive hotels in big cities, but not necessarily, because many travelers need to go out and visit factories. They need to go maybe visit smaller cities, and they also may run into hotels that don't accept foreign nationals. So the policies that have been introduced in this regard are definitely welcome. However, they are not going to fix the issues right away, as maybe some of the official news regarding them has suggested. For example, the hotel policy that essentially requires all hotels to accept foreign nationals is, in practice, it's a very complicated issue because most hotels in China are not that familiar with dealing with passports. They may not have staff who are trained to read a passport, which is understandable. It's a document that's not in Chinese, that every country varies slightly, and it can be confusing. But if China still wants to enforce the hotel or the residence registration requirement for foreign nationals, then they need to find a way to make sure that hotels have a way to do it. And my personal experience so far making use of the hotel policy has been that hotels do seem to be making more of an effort to take foreign nationals. However, in practice, the implementation is very messy. And they're trying, but they don't exactly know, especially in smaller places, hotels don't really understand how to register a foreign national. And you may be sort of carted off to the police station or given a bunch of confusing, or asked a bunch of confusing questions if you try to make use of the hotel policy and stay in a smaller Chinese city. I think the payment policy, likewise, is a big improvement, but it's still far from perfect. One of the biggest problems that remains is that Alipay and WeChat, if registered with a credit card, a foreign credit card, typically cannot make payments to individual accounts, which is problematic because many businesses, especially smaller businesses, still are using an individual QR code for some of their activity. And so if you run into a business that is doing that, you may find that you're unable to pay. And I know some people who visited and ordered a coffee and from a small shop and discovered that they couldn't pay for it after the coffee was already made. So it's a very awkward situation. China is, as far as I know, one of the only countries in the world where as a tourist, you'll have trouble using either cash or credit card. It's very common for countries to have issues taking credit cards, but usually cash is an alternative. This is one of the only places where you come and really cash and credit card is not going to get you that far.
Remi, do you have other suggestions in terms of how China could facilitate inbound travel with policy improvements?
I think we pretty much addressed all the issues. I just maybe want to insist on the explanation and the access to the information, because as we said, I'm not sure in our countries that all people are familiar, do understand and know how to access these information. So I really insist on the fact that Chinese authorities make a strong effort, and because they already made the first move, which is, as I said, quite tremendous. It would be a pity that due to the lack of information, Western audience would not have access clearly to those explanations. And that's even more, as Austin pointed it out, that's even more important for the complicated schemes. I would say it's the same for the payment issue. When you're in China, you're familiar, you know WeChat, you know Alipay. So Westerners who live in China or who frequently travel to China might not be the best people to explain to newcomer how to use the system. So there should be also, I think, a strong effort from the service providers and from maybe also the government agency in charge of promoting China as a destination, either for business or tourism, really a strong effort in order to explain how the system works. And that might also help people in China to understand how to improve the system. Because, I mean, through those exchanges with users who are not familiar with the system, there might be also a strong gain of experience that would help make the system more user-friendly.
That's exactly what we experienced as well when we prepare for the WeChat post explaining this visa-free or transit schemes. We looked at many different website pages and also the official WeChat account. And we compiled all the information and explained with our own understanding. I would very much agree with you.
Actually, when we were doing research for the WeChat post, we found some government websites that had outdated or very misleading information available in English. Right now, there's no comprehensive place explaining all the visa-free policies other than our WeChat post out there for people to use. So there's no official source that is truly comprehensive and explains all the nuances, all the requirements in a way that is clear and easy for people to understand. And I think putting something out there like that for visa-free travel would be really helpful.
That's all for today. Thank you again, Remi and Austin, for joining. If you like our podcast, please subscribe to China Dispatches, recommend it to your friends and colleagues, and share it on social media. Also, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can find the contact details in the show notes. This is Gao Rui from China Dispatches. Thanks for listening.